Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going back to the 1950s.
Ooh, the 50s.
The Eisenhower era, to be more precise.
Okay.
To explore a really fascinating period, the beginnings of the Civil Rights Movement.
Right.
You know, it's funny when you think about it.
Yeah.
We think about the 50s and like poodle skirts and conformity come to mind.
Totally.
But, you know, like under the surface,
Yeah.
all this major change was brewing.
Yeah.
So we've got a great podcast episode to guide us today. So buckle up.
It's a good one. It really makes you wonder,
Yeah.
was Eisenhower just going with the flow on civil rights?
Right.
Or, was he like quietly pushing things along behind the scenes?
That's the question, right?
Yeah.
Let's start with Eisenhower himself.
Okay.
You know, our source describes him as this, like, war hero, super popular president,
Right.
but also, like, really cautious. Not a radical by any means.
Definitely not. And that caution, it really comes through in his early approach to civil rights.
Like, how so?
Well, so this is right after Brown v. Board of Education in 1954.
Right.
Huge, huge. When the Supreme Court basically said
Yeah.
separate schools are not equal,
Right.
but Eisenhower wasn't exactly rushing to enforce it.
Interesting.
He even said this one time. He said,
Yeah. What do you say?
we might be talking about social disintegration
Oh, wow.
if we push integration too fast.
That's wild. Talk about a window into the mindset back then.
I know.
Like, it's so easy to forget
yeah.
how resistant, like, afraid people were of change.
Oh, absolutely. Plus,
Yeah.
Eisenhower was in a tough spot politically.
I can imagine.
He needed those Southern Democrats to
Yeah.
get things done in Congress.
Right.
And they were, shall we say, less than enthusiastic about integration.
Right. So you couldn't exactly, like, rock the boat too hard.
Yeah, exactly.
Make too many waves.
Right. Like, take the case of Autherine Lucy
Okay.
at the University of Alabama in 1956.
Okay.
So she was the first Black student admitted there. Wow.
Thanks to a federal court order. But she faced so much hostility that the university kicked her out
What?
after just a few days.
No way.
And Eisenhower didn't step in.
So I guess actions speak louder than words.
They do.
Like, it's a reminder that this, go slow approach,
Yeah.
like as our source called it,
Mhm.
was pretty typical of the time.
Yeah, pretty much.
But then, we have Little Rock, Arkansas, 1957,
Oh, yeah.
which really throws a wrench into things.
Little Rock was a turning point.
Big time.
It forced Eisenhower's hand
Oh, so...
in a way nothing else had. Like, imagine 9 Black teenagers, the Little Rock 9,
Right?
trying to go to Central High School.
Yeah.
And they're met with, like, this angry white mob literally blocking the school doors.
Oh, gosh. And it's hard to even imagine
I know.
the courage
Yeah.
it took for them to keep showing up
Every day, yeah.
day after day.
It's incredible.
And Eisenhower couldn't ignore it any longer.
So what did he do?
He federalized the Arkansas National Guard
Wow.
and sent in the 101st Airborne,
wow.
real Army troops.
Wow, to escort those kids to school.
Yeah.
Talk about a dramatic move.
Right. It was the first time since Reconstruction
Wow.
that the federal government had used that kind of force
Wow.
to enforce civil rights.
Wow. So some people say, right,
Uh-huh.
that Eisenhower, like, he was just asserting his authority, right?
They pulled
The
it
law.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, like, fully embracing integration
Yeah.
wholeheartedly.
Yeah, that's what our source suggests.
Yeah, but still, like, a huge symbolic step, though,
But
right?
sure.
It set a precedent for future presidents to take, like, a more active role
Yeah.
in civil rights.
Absolutely. But while all this was happening,
Yeah,
let's not forget about the people on the ground,
right.
The Black activists who were pushing for change,
Yeah.
from the bottom up,
Right.
often at great personal risk.
Yeah, you're so right.
Yeah.
Like, those grassroots movements were gaining so much momentum.
For sure.
And our source, highlights the
Yeah.
Montgomery bus boycott
Right.
as, like, a prime example.
Big one.
You know the story, like,
Yeah.
Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the bus in 1955.
Yep.
And boom.
It sparked a year-long boycott of the entire bus system.
I mean, amazing, right?
Yeah.
Led by a young Martin Luther King Jr., no less.
No less.
And with, like, amazing support from organizations like the NAACP.
Of course.
And it actually worked.
It did.
Like, they put so much pressure on the bus company,
Uh-huh.
and it attracted national attention.
It did.
The Supreme Court finally ruled bus segregation unconstitutional in 56.
Crazy.
Like, that's the power of people
Yeah.
coming together and saying,
Yeah.
enough is enough.
Powerful stuff.
It really makes you think, even if Eisenhower wasn't out there, like,
Right.
marching with them, the pressure from these movements, like, must have been enormous.
It must have been. They really forced the issue onto the national agenda.
Yeah.
And they achieved these incredible victories
Yeah.
through their own, courage and determination.
Absolutely. And it kind of leads us to some interesting questions, right, about
Yeah.
how historians view Eisenhower's record on civil
Yeah.
rights. Because it's not a simple,
Right.
like black and white picture.
Yep.
Like, some historians, the revisionists,
For revisionists.
they believe that Eisenhower was more strategic than people give him credit for.
Yeah, so they think he was working behind the scenes.
So, like, working behind the scenes.
Yeah, trying to make progress.
Without causing too much of a stir.
Exactly.
So they're not buying that, like, reluctant participant narrative.
Not entirely.
Okay.
They point to things like Little Rock,
Okay.
his judicial appointments,
Yeah.
his attempts to build consensus for, moderate reforms.
Gotcha.
So they see it as a more calculated approach.
Yeah. So not all just reacting to events.
Not necessarily. But
Yeah.
then there's another group,
Okay.
the Cold War historians, who emphasize
Okay.
the Cold War context.
Okay, so, like,
Remember, this was the height of the Cold War.
right, yeah.
And the U.S. and the Soviet Union are, locked in this ideological battle.
Right.
And America's image on the world stage
Yeah.
really mattered.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It wouldn't look good for the land of the free to be, so openly discriminatory.
Right. And I'm sure the Soviets were more than happy to point that out, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So these historians argue that Eisenhower, being, this military man,
Okay.
right, and he understood global politics,
Right.
knew that he had to address civil rights
Interesting.
to, maintain America's credibility,
Right.
on the world stage.
That makes sense.
So even if he wasn't personally, passionate about the issue,
Yeah.
he saw it as a strategic necessity
Very
to
amazing.
win the Cold War, basically. Yeah.
So even if he wasn't personally passionate about it, he knew it was necessary.
Exactly.
Okay. And then, we have the institutional historians
Yeah.
who kind of remind us
Right.
that Eisenhower was operating within a very specific political system.
Right. You mean the Southern Democrats?
Yeah, yeah, who held so much power in Congress, right?
Exactly.
They could block anything they didn't like. So
Yeah, I know.
Eisenhower really had to, walk a fine line
Yeah.
to avoid alienating them.
And derailing his whole agenda, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So those historians are saying he did what he could within a system
Mm-hmm.
that was kind of stacked against
Yeah.
civil rights progress.
Exactly.
Okay, so not a hero, not a villain,
Right.
just a president trying to,
Yeah.
navigate this, really tricky situation.
A tough spot.
And then, of course, we can't forget the civil rights historians
Yeah.
who really focus on the activists themselves, right?
Yes.
The, grassroots movements.
The people who are putting their lives on the line every day.
Exactly. Pushing for change from the bottom up.
From the bottom up. Yeah.
So they're arguing that while Eisenhower played a role,
Mm-hmm.
the real engine of change was...
The tireless work of these activists.
Oh.
Yeah.
So it's not just about what's happening in the White House,
Right.
but what's happening in the streets,
Yes.
in communities all across the country.
Exactly. It's about the courage and determination of
Yeah.
ordinary people who refuse to accept the status quo.
Absolutely.
Their efforts, they created the pressure
Yeah.
that forced the government to act.
Wow. When you look at it that way, it's clear that, the story of the civil rights movement
Yeah.
is so much bigger than any one president
Right.
or any single piece of legislation.
It really is. That's what makes it so fascinating.
Right.
Yeah, it's a story about people, power,
Right.
and the struggle for justice.
Absolutely.
And it's a story that continues to resonate today.
It really does. So before we move on to Eisenhower's, specific actions,
Right.
the Civil Rights Acts of 57 and 60,
Okay.
let's take a look at, a less discussed aspect
Yep.
of his approach to minority issues,
Okay.
his policy towards Native Americans.
Right.
And this is where things get a little complicated, right?
Okay.
When it came to, black civil rights,
Mm-hmm.
Eisenhower was, hesitant, but with Native Americans,
Yeah.
he took, a much more active approach,
Right.
but not exactly in a good way.
Not a good
Our
one.
source calls it the termination policy,
Yeah, Terminator.
and it was all about assimilating Native Americans.
Right.
Like, basically,
Yeah.
erasing their distinct cultures and stripping them of their sovereignty.
Kind of shocking, right?
Yeah.
Like, the government literally wanted to end federal recognition of tribes and, like, turn over control of reservations to the states.
Wow.
They thought they were doing Native Americans a favor
Oh,
by, like, forcing them to integrate into mainstream society.
so, like, basically saying, forget your history.
Yeah.
Forget your traditions.
Yeah.
Just become like everyone else.
Exactly.
That's crazy.
And the results were disastrous.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Many tribes lost their land.
No.
Their cultural institutions were weakened.
Oh, Shan.
Poverty and social problems, like, skyrocketed.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder, right, that, like, progress for one group
Yeah.
doesn't always mean progress for all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like we were talking about earlier, right?
Right.
Even during times of, like,
Yeah.
change,
Yeah.
some groups can be left behind.
Right.
Or even, like, actively harmed by government policies.
Sadly. Yeah.
But let's
Right.
get back to Eisenhower's actions on black civil rights.
Right.
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 He did sign, like, two important pieces of legislation.
Uh-huh.
The Civil Rights Acts of 57 and 60.
Yeah. Big deal.
These were the first civil rights laws passed
Yeah.
since Reconstruction, right?
They were, and that's, like, significant in itself. Like,
Yeah.
it shows that the federal government was finally
Yeah.
starting to acknowledge its responsibility
Yeah.
to protect the rights of Black citizens.
So, like, what did these acts actually do?
So the 57 Act
Okay.
focused on voting rights,
Okay.
which were constantly being undermined in the South.
Oh, right.
And it created a civil rights division within the Justice Department
Okay.
to, like, investigate
Uh-huh.
and prosecute violations. But
Yeah.
those Southern Democrats,
Right.
they fought hard to weaken the law, so
No, man.
its impact was limited.
So, like, a step in the right direction, but not, like, a giant leap.
Yeah, pretty much. Baby steps.
What about the 60 Act?
The 1960 Act? It tried to strengthen the 57 Act.
Okay.
Closing some loopholes and giving the Justice Department more tools
Okay.
to enforce voting rights.
Yeah.
But again, Southern Democrats managed to water it down. Ugh, it's so frustrating.
I know.
Like, they just kept blocking progress.
I know. But so, while these laws
Yeah.
didn't revolutionize voting rights overnight,
Okay.
They were the first crack in the wall of Jim Crow,
Interesting.
signaling a shift in the federal government's role.
So it sounds like a mixed bag, right?
Yeah.
Like, some progress, but not enough to, like, solve
Yeah.
the deep-seated problems of racial discrimination.
Right, exactly.
Like, it makes you wonder
Yeah.
how much credit Eisenhower deserves
Yeah.
for these laws.
Like, he signed them, but
Yeah.
he didn't exactly, like, champion them
Yeah.
or push for stronger measures,
Right. It seems like he was more interested in, like, keeping things calm,
Yeah.
avoiding political battles than, like,
Yeah.
pushing for radical change.
Yeah. More of a reluctant reformer than a bold leader.
Yeah, maybe. But you got to remember, right?
Yeah.
He was also dealing with, like, a lot of pushback.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Those Southern Democrats, like, they had a lot of power.
Oh, tons.
And he couldn't afford to alienate them completely.
Right.
But even with his, like, cautious approach,
Yeah.
his presidency did see,
Yeah.
like, some incredibly important moments for the
Yeah.
civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Brown v. Board, the Montgomery bus boycott, Little Rock,
Right.
and those civil rights acts, like, limited as they were,
Yeah.
helped lay the groundwork
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
the even bigger changes that were coming in the 60s.
For sure. Like, it was a time of tremendous upheaval
Right.
when the old order was, like, starting to crumble.
Right. Yeah. And, like, while Eisenhower might not have been the most vocal advocate
Right.
for change,
Yeah.
he played a role nonetheless.
He did. He did. And that's why, understanding his legacy is so complex.
Yeah.
He wasn't a firebrand,
Yeah.
some later presidents, but
Right.
he wasn't a bystander either, right?
It seems like he often, like,
Yeah.
reacted to events
Right.
rather than, like, proactively shaping them.
Yeah, but you've got to remember the political realities he was
Right.
facing.
Right, of course.
Absolutely. To fully grasp his role in the civil rights movement, we really need to, like,
Yeah.
consider those different historical perspectives.
Right.
We talked about earlier,
Yeah.
they offer, like, valuable insights into the forces that shaped this era
Mm-hmm.
and, the challenges of interpreting the past.
Okay, so let's unpack those different viewpoints a little more.
Yeah.
You mentioned the revisionist historians.
Yeah.
What makes their take on Eisenhower, like, different?
Well, as the name suggests, they're kind of revising or challenging the traditional view of Eisenhower.
Okay.
They see him as more, like, deliberate
Okay.
and strategic than he's often given credit for.
Okay.
They argue that he was working behind the scenes, nudging things along
Okay.
when he could.
So they're not buying that, like, reluctant participant narrative.
Not entirely.
Okay.
They point to things like his handling of the Little Rock crisis,
Okay.
his appointment of, like, federal judges who were sympathetic to civil rights,
Okay.
and, his efforts to build consensus for, like, moderate reforms.
Okay.
So they see a more nuanced approach.
So maybe he was playing, like, a longer game, like trying to achieve progress without, like, rocking the boat too much?
That's what they're suggesting, yeah. But then we have the Cold War historians who bring, like, a whole different perspective to the table.
Right.
They remind us that this was the height of the Cold War.
Of course, yeah.
And the U.S. was locked in this, like, global ideological struggle with the Soviet Union.
Right.
You know what I mean? And America's image abroad really mattered.
Right, so America couldn't afford to look like a hypocrite.
Right.
Preaching freedom and democracy while practicing segregation at home.
Exactly. And the Soviets were all too happy to exploit that contradiction. Right.
Of course.
They used America's, like, racial problems as propaganda to undermine its moral authority.
For sure.
So the Cold War historians argue that Eisenhower, being this, like, military man with this deep understanding of global politics, recognized that America needed to make progress on civil rights to, maintain its credibility on the world stage.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Yeah, so even if he wasn't personally driven by, like, a passion for racial equality, he saw it as, like, a strategic necessity.
In the context of the Cold War.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about those institutional historians?
Okay.
We mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
What's their take on Eisenhower and civil rights?
They kind of bring us back down to earth.
Oh, okay.
Reminding us that Eisenhower wasn't operating in a vacuum.
Right.
He was working within a specific political system, with all its complexities and limitations.
Right.
You know what I mean?
You mean, like, dealing with Congress?
Right.
Especially those, powerful Southern Democrats who weren't exactly fans of
No, they weren't.
Civil rights.
Yeah, they controlled key committees and could easily block any legislation they didn't like.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the institutional historians argue that Eisenhower had to tread carefully, you know, making compromises, picking his battles.
Right.
They're basically saying he did the best he could.
Within a system that was kind of
within a system.
inherently biased against rapid progress.
Exactly.
So not necessarily a hero, not a villain.
Yeah.
Just a president.
A president trying to navigate a really tricky situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But we can't forget the perspective of civil rights historians.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Who tend to focus on, like, the activists themselves.
The people who are putting their lives on the line. Yeah, exactly. To
Same.
demand change.
Right. The Rosa Parkses, the Martin Luther King Jr.'s.
Right, exactly.
You know.
The countless others.
Yeah.
Who organized boycotts, protests, legal challenges.
They argue that while presidents like Eisenhower played a role, the real engine of progress was
this groundswell of activism.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's not just about, like, what's happening in the White House.
Exactly.
Like what's happening in the streets.
Yeah.
In communities all across the country.
It's about the courage and determination of ordinary people who refused to accept the status quo.
Absolutely.
And their efforts created the pressure that forced the government to act.
Wow. When you look at it that way, it's clear that, like, the story of the civil rights movement is so much bigger.
Bigger than any one president or any single piece of legislation.
Yeah, it really is. It's just amazing to study.
It's fascinating, right? It's a story about people, power, and the struggle for justice.
Absolutely.
It's a story that continues to resonate today.
It really does. So as we, like, you know, wrap up our deep dive into the Eisenhower era and the early years of the civil rights movement, I'm, like, you know, left with this sense of awe.
Yeah.
At the, like, you know, courage and resilience of the people.
Of the people who fought for equality.
Yeah, exactly.
And a renewed appreciation for, like,
yeah,
the complexity of history.
It's rarely simple, is it?
It's rarely straightforward.
No, it's not.
That's okay. Like, the beauty of history lies in, like, grappling with its complexities, considering different perspectives.
For sure.
And recognizing that we're still learning from the past.
Absolutely. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this journey back to the 1950s.
Hope so.
And we encourage you to keep exploring this, pivotal era in American history.
For sure.
There's so much more to, learn and discover.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.